In the last section, I talked about the overall structure of the cerebellar system and the neurons within that system, and I began to talk about their connectivity. So let's pull together all that connectivity information schematically. A small segment of the cerebellar cortex is represented at the top, and a representation of the cerebellar nuclei at the bottom. There's the granule cells and Purkinje cells in the cerebellar cortex. The Purkinje dendritic trees are drawn edge-on, and the outputs from the granule cells go up through the Purkinje layer. These outputs are excitatory, so I'm going to draw them in green, but to simplify the picture, I'm just going to draw three of them. In the molecular layer, they do a 90-degree bend and run for long distances parallel to each other and perpendicular to the Purkinje dendrites. So all these granule axons are called the parallel fibers. If a parallel fiber synapses on a Purkinje dendrite, it only makes one or perhaps two synapses. In the cerebellar nuclei, there are two types of projection neurons, and the Purkinje cells are inhibitory and target both types. A lot of inputs come into the cerebellum from a range of cortical areas, both sensory and prefrontal, and these cortical outputs first target neurons in the pontine nuclei. The pontine nuclei neurons are excitatory and target the granule cells. And these axons from the pontine nuclei are called mossy fibers because of their appearance. Branches from the mossy fibers also target both types of cerebellar nuclei neurons. Another source of inputs to the cerebellum is the motor cortex and the spinal cord. These inputs arrive at the inferior olive. The output from one inferior olive neuron targets a small group of Purkinje cells, sometimes just one, never more than 10. The inferior olive axon wraps itself around and through the Purkinje dendrite, and as a result it's called a climbing fiber. A Purkinje gets a lot of synapses from one climbing fiber, but doesn't get synapses from any other climbing fibers. So the Purkinje only gets inputs from one inferior olive neuron. The climbing fibers also have side branches that target the two types of cerebellar nuclei cells. The outputs from the inhibitive cerebellar nuclei neurons target the inferior olive, while the outputs of the excitatory cerebellar nuclei neurons target the thalamus and the spinal cord. So these excitatory outputs are the only outputs from the cerebellar system as a whole. One other source of inputs is the dopaminergic neurons of the ventral tegmental area, and these neurons target both the Purkinjes and the granule cells. And recall that we discussed that the ventral basal ganglia has something to do with rewarding behaviors.